Welcome to this quarter's event in our lecture series in public thinking. My name is Christopher Wilde. I'm a professor of Germanic Studies and Theater and Performance Studies, but more importantly, I'm the faculty director of the Parrhesia Program for Public Thinking and Discourse. Before I introduce one of the co-organizers of this event, who will introduce our esteemed guest and speaker, James Bennet, let me say a few words about the lecture series and the program for public thinking. Lectures for public thinking. Public thinking, isn't that an oxymoron? A contradiction in terms? Historically, deep thought, the contemplative life, requires withdrawal from the hubbub of public life. When Lady Philosophy visits Boethius in deep thought, he was relegated to solitary confinement in a prison cell. It is to a stove-heated room in southwestern Germany that Descartes withdraws to discover the cogito and the foundations of a wonderful science. And when it comes to share his thinking with Europe's res publica literaria, the father of modern philosophy is reticent and cautious. It is only Kant who imagined for intellectuals an important role in the public sphere, made possible by the media technology of print and dramatic expansion of the reading public. In fact, it was only in that very public sphere that intellectuals could think and communicate unfettered from constraints and duties. Freedom of thought and discourse as the condition of possibility of enlightenment was not possible in private, only in public. That vision was already wishful thinking in the 18th century. Today, the pressures on public thinking, on responsible and rigorous thinking in public, have become significantly more intense and extensive. Whereas good thinking depends on precision, nuance, and tolerance of ambiguity, today's partisan and identity politics favors stark contrasts, stereotyping, and prejudicing. Whereas constructive thinking thrives on debate and testing, today's public discourse is often about scoring points, preaching to the converted, or retaining viewers or readers. Whereas interesting and original thinking starts with a moment of wonder and astonishment, as Socrates tells us, the algorithms governing social media bombard us with a never-ending repetition of the same in order to monetize our confirmation bias and capture our attention. Whereas substantive thinking requires space, both in terms of word count and place apart, the all-engulfing and bite-sized elusive information discourages the discussion of complex ideas. Where sophisticated thinking demands concentration, the monetization of attention in the digital economy fragmentizes our perceptual field and mental sphere into smaller particles. As knowledge producers and educators, institutions like the University of Chicago have an obligation to contribute to cultivating practices of rigorous, responsible, and nuanced thinking, not only in private, but also in public. To be sure, universities have in many ways not been heeding that obligation. Like much of society, they bow to the pressures of efficient professionalization. Rather than trying to transform the culture of public discourse, they try stay out of the public eye and not get drawn into controversy. This lecture series in public thinking attempts to heed this call and provide students, faculty, and staff opportunities to hear from and engage with prominent intellectuals who have made a name for themselves by their thoughtful interventions into the public sphere. The partnership between the college's Parrhesia Program for Public Thinking and Discourse and the Point magazine, founded not coincidentally by alumni of the University of Chicago's Committee of Social Thought, is exemplary for bridging the divide between scholarly and public discourse, academia and society, gown and town. By modeling public thinking, we aim to nurture a culture of public discourse across campus and beyond. Without further ado, let me introduce John Baskin to you. He received, that's the person who is going to introduce our speaker. He received his PhD from the Committee of Social Thought with a dissertation on David Foster Wallace, which has been published as Ordinary Unhappiness, the Therapeutic Fiction of David Foster Wallace, with Stanford University Press. And he's one of the founding editors of the Point magazine, a print and digital magazine of philosophical writing that embodies two distinct but complementary convictions. On the one hand, that humanistic thinking has relevance for contemporary life. On the other, that our lives are full of experiences worth thinking about. As a side job, he is the associate director for the MA program in creative publishing and critical journalism at the New School for Social Thought. But not least, he's the author of numerous articles in the Point magazine, The Nation, the New York Review of Books, the Los Angeles Review and Books, the New York Times, etc. And before I pass on the gavel, let me thank Nora Titone from the Parrhesia Program and Rachel Wiseman from the Point magazine for all the work they have put into bringing our speaker to campus. And finally, let me thank the Zell Family Foundation and Helen Zell, who is in the audience today, for her generosity, support, and unflagging enthusiasm and trust in the program. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, and also for your unflagging trust in this program. The idea behind this series, as Chris mentioned, was to create a space for thoughtful commentary on the challenges and opportunities that we confront in our public conversation. That is, the conversation we are always having, to paraphrase Hannah Arendt, with ourselves about ourselves. And we wanted that commentary to come, for the most part, not from academics, but from people who are out in the trenches, so to speak, of that public conversation, whether as journalists, editors, artists, activists, or politicians. Today, we're extremely lucky to have someone who has been very much in those trenches, and for a long time, and who is, I believe, uniquely suited to speaking to some of the distinctive challenges the media faces in covering our highly unusual political moment. And I was prepared to say this even before news broke this morning that the opinion editor of the Washington Post had resigned after the newspaper's owner, Jeff Bezos, announced plans to focus the opinion section on, quote, personal liberties and free markets. Currently a senior editor for The Economist, James Bennet has an illustrious and varied career in the news media, occupying many different roles. For the New York Times, he was a reporter, a White House correspondent, and a Jerusalem bureau chief before being named in 2016 as the opinion editor, a job he did for the entirety of President Trump's first term in office. In between those roles at the Times, Bennet served from 2006 to 2016 as the editor-in-chief and co-president of The Atlantic, which he helped transform into an intellectually diverse and profitable, no small feat, magazine, which managed to harness, as opposed to being swallowed up by, some of the powerful forces and voices that were just then emerging on digital media. The Atlantic won 4 National Magazine Awards during Bennet's tenure. As opinion editor at the Times, Bennet applied some of the same strategies as at The Atlantic, navigating Trump's first term while diversifying the opinion pages both ideologically and in terms of their racial and gender composition. Bennett's term at the Times ended notoriously in the summer of 2020 after the paper published an op-ed by Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton during the George Floyd protests. As Bennet later recounted, the higher-ups at the Times, including publisher Arthur Salzberger, initially signaled support for the publication of the op-ed before following a social media-driven campaign led by staffers at the paper, asking Bennet to apologize for having published it and then to step down as opinion editor. In 2023, Bennet published an essay about the incident for The Economist, which was titled, "When the New York Times Lost Its Way." The article looks back critically at the ideological narrowing Bennet had witnessed at the Times, saying the paper was in danger of becoming, quote, the publication through which America's progressive elite talks to itself about an America that does not really exist. But it was about much more than any one incident or publication. Indeed, I found this article that James wrote to be the most incisive and comprehensive articulation of the competing philosophies and visions of journalism, and especially of the role the journalist plays in relation to the public, that came into conflict not only at the Times, but all across liberal media and publishing during President Trump's first term. As he'll be talking more about this conflict today, I won't say more about it here, except that it's a conflict that many in this room who are students and professors will also recognize having taken place in academic context, and that its underlying structure points to fundamental questions about the responsibilities of public thinkers of all kinds, questions that can be traced back to Dewey and Lippmann in the American tradition, and indeed to Plato and Socrates in the humanistic one. It was because of this article that I immediately thought of James when I considered who I would most want to hear from about the developments we have seen in media and in our public political conversation this year, both in the run-up to and in the aftermath of the election. How we got here and perhaps what we might do about it is the subject of James's talk, which will be followed up by a discussion between the two of us and then an opportunity for a more general Q&A. And with that, I introduce James Bennet.
Thank you very much, John, for the introduction. And Chris, thank you. It's an honor to be participating in this lecture series. And I'm very appreciative of all of your being here today. Can you hear me? The title of this talk is framed as a question: is there a mainstream media? And at risk of having you all get up and leave right away, I'm going to skip straight to the answer, which is, of course, there isn't. And I suspect most of you already know that. What was once the mainstream media, the networks, the newspapers, certain magazines, years ago lost the command that it had of the nation's attention, and with it the ability to create a shared national understanding of what was going on in the world of reality. As Chris described, we get our information now by finding our way through a bewildering, ever-splintering media landscape. The proportion of people who say they turn to a news site or an app as their main source of news these days is continuing to drop. It's down to about 22% globally. That's a drop of 10 points in just 7 or 8 years, according to the annual survey that Reuters does with Oxford. Even the big online platforms themselves are continuing to splinter the audience. A matter of a decade ago, 2 of them commanded a plurality of users, and now there's 6 platforms that each draw about 10%. You know, in the early years of the internet, and there are a number of people in this room who probably were not present for those years. It was, but those of us who were, I think, will agree with me. It was a time of tremendous optimism and excitement about the possibilities of this new technology. It was going to enable new forms of citizen journalism to flourish and promote truth and greater understanding. And I shared those hopes, certainly, and even expectations. And it's maybe forgivable because it's part of an old pattern. It's true throughout history that we tend to get very excited and even a little Panglossian about the arrival of any new revolutionary communications technology. At the end of the 19th century, Nikola Tesla predicted that his new telegraph was going to make war impossible. Abolish war was his term. And then a few years later, the inventor of the radio said the same thing. It would make war impossible. And that was just a couple of years before World War I broke out. In the case of the internet, being able to communicate with one another so much more easily is making it harder for us to understand each other. Users' experience, confirmed by social science, has shown that it's in this media landscape in which the mainstream media has left the scene, social media promotes lies and antipathy much more effectively than it does truth or empathy. According to that same Oxford survey, we now rely upon so-called influencers to guide our path through this landscape. These influencers, and far more than we do any brand or even any journalist, and they tend to be partisan. Number 1 on the survey's list of 95,000 people was Tucker Carlson, followed by Joe Rogan. The only conventional TV anchor or journalist to make the top 10 was Anderson Cooper, and he came in number 7 after Ben Shapiro and Alex Jones. So what was once called the mainstream media is now more commonly called the legacy media, but I don't think that term is quite right either, because it leaves out newish digital brands that share many of the values that I associate with the legacy media. I don't think I have the greatest label either, but for purposes of this talk, I'm going to refer to it as the institutional media, because I think what properly distinguishes these organizations is that they aspire to have an institutional identity that's greater than, that transforms any individual voice, and that they're attempting, at least aspiring, to cultivate values that will endure beyond, like any healthy institution does, that'll endure beyond any one generation. And among those values is that they want to reach an audience that crosses partisan and demographic lines, an audience that itself represents the American mainstream. And if the American mainstream media no longer exists, I do believe that an American mainstream is still out there, eager to be communicated with. I want to back up and talk about how we got here, and that's going to be most of this talk. It's not a story about bad faith and much less about bad people. It's mostly about changes in technology and related changes in commercial incentives, big giant forces that have transformed journalism, and along the way, some bad decisions got made. These two forces have always shaped our understanding of what counts as news, and therefore our sense of what's real beyond our doorstep, what we can actually apprehend with our own senses. But I do think in what has been a very confusing and even frightening time in the industry that I grew up in, some organizations that we called mainstream media have made mistakes that accelerated the institutional slide toward irrelevance. I'm going to talk about that too. I am mindful about voicing criticisms like this right now, because this is, I think, the most challenging moment in at least my lifetime for serious journalism. Arguably, on the plus side, it's actually a great time for journalism because there's no shortage of news that's important, because huge ideas are under debate or ought to be. Institutions are, it makes me very sad, but journalistically, it's a very rich target, are cracking apart domestically and globally. There's just no shortage of big questions that need to be asked, to be investigated, big ideas to be debated. The American government, its effectiveness at home and abroad is either being torn apart or possibly being rejuvenated before our eyes. And either way, it's a hell of a story from a journalist perspective, as morally despicable as that point of view might seem. It's actually the proper journalistic one. The downside in this era for the legacy press or institutional press is that it's under assault. I can't laugh it off when someone as powerful as Elon Musk, who presents himself as an advocate of free speech, says that journalists from 60 Minutes deserve to be jailed. Likewise, it alarms me to see Donald Trump banning reporters from the Associated Press from covering White House events because the AP won't call the Gulf of Mexico by his preferred name. The Gulf of America won't only call it by his preferred name. They want to use both. It may seem like a silly or frivolous thing, but it's not. I don't care who the president is. It's a basic matter of press freedom that the president does not get to dictate what words a media organization uses. Like a lot of people, this president seems to love free speech, at least up until the point, at least as long as he hears, at least as long as he likes what he hears. A few days ago, at the annual meeting of the Conservative Political Action Committee, CPAC, if you know that organization, Elon Musk sat for an interview, and he talked about how through his work at DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, he had discovered that, quote, a massive amount of your tax dollars is going to legacy media companies, unquote. That was a reference to the fact that the government was buying some subscriptions, including the publication I work for, The Economist. For my own part, I'd say that's probably a good investment if it was helping government workers do their jobs better, but we can have an argument about that. What's more striking is what Musk went on to claim, that this government spending, and he didn't say how much it was, explained, quote, why the legacy media all says the same thing at the same time. He was arguing that because of this government spending, the legacy media had become a mouthpiece for the state. That's a particular silly claim coming from him. Even back in the 1970s, in the heyday of the mainstream media, when the network newscasts reached about 1 in 3 American viewers every night, that mainstream media didn't celebrate or promote any president's priorities the way Elon Musk promotes Donald Trump on X. Elon Musk is an employee of the state. He's a giant contractor of the state. And through X, and he owns X and controls its algorithm. And through his own feed, he reaches 200 million people with dozens of posts a day. many of them extolling the priorities of Donald Trump. And that may actually not be the starkest example of our new statist media, the likes of which we've never seen before. Donald Trump, as you know, has his own mighty X feed with more than 100 million followers, but he also controls Truth Social. And that's where he makes a lot of his most important pronouncements as president of the United States. For the first time in our history, the president himself is the largest shareholder in his own influential media company. That's what a mouthpiece for the state looks like. And it's a far more partisan and, in my view, less trustworthy means of understanding the world than the legacy media ever was. And I don't think we've yet really reckoned with how profound this change is and what its consequences may prove to be. And that's why I'm mindful at this moment for piling on and voicing some criticisms of the legacy media, but I'm doing it in hopes of being constructive. And because I think the institutional press needs to recommit itself to certain basic journalistic principles and attitudes if we have any hope of recovering some shared sense, some shared national sense of what's true and what's not. So let me start, if I may, begging your indulgence back in the beginning with the first paper that was published in America before the United States existed. It appeared in Boston in September 1690, and it was called Public Occurrences, Both Foreign and Domestic. The editor said the paper would appear just once a month, unless, he said, any glut of occurrences should happen. So just think about that. Like, imagine a reality, an understanding of news, a pace of events, and of the distribution of information in which publishing once a month would seem like more than often enough to take note of anything that actually mattered. And by the way, it only published for 1 month in the end. It was suppressed almost immediately because the editor also said he looked forward to exposing lies by the government at the time, the colonial government. That idea of news, that it was something quite occasional, often sort of providentially determined, endured for generations, really a couple hundred years, until the 19th century when the technology of the industry started to change. The rotary press was able to print on both sides and churn out many, many more papers, so all of a sudden there was more space to fill. Then came the telegraph, the radio, the television, which could reach far more people, and that also meant even more space, more need to come up with fresh news to replace all the old news that was turning stale. Where did it all come from? Some of it was made up, some of it was sensationalism, but a lot of it came from more reporters dispatched to more places, covering a broader array of subjects, and the world also obliged the need to fill all this space by speeding up and becoming ever more complicated. This new technology changed the definition of news, and it also changed the business and the ethos of journalism as was practiced in the United States. In the 18th and 19th century, news was distributed largely in small circulation newspapers, which were generally quite partisan. And the reason they were quite partisan is, one reason anyway, it was a commercial one, which was that was an easy way to cultivate a loyal audience. But now, with this expansion in scale, publishers and broadcasters saw a chance to reach mass audiences and make money instead by selling advertising. And attracting as many eyeballs as possible to ads meant alienating as few people as possible. And that helped give rise in America to the ideal of objectivity in reporting. It just made good business sense to strive for a straighter, just the facts presentation of reality. And it was during this period in 1895 that a publisher from Tennessee named Adolph Ox gained control of the New York Times. And like some other publishers then, he saw an opportunity to stand out by producing more trustworthy journalism. And he published an announcement promising that under his leadership, the Times would report the news impartially without fear or favor. He also didn't declare fidelity to any political party or ideology, but instead he said he wanted the paper to be a forum for the consideration of all questions of public importance. And so it would invite intelligent discussion from all shades of opinion. Presenting a wide range of views best served the curious and open-minded reader. And it was also another way to establish the newspaper's impartiality and credibility. These sorts of ideas about objectivity and openness to debate spread unevenly throughout the news business. And then after World War I, really, the industry recognized a need to build trust, and it set out to professionalize itself. The American Society for Newspaper Editors was created in 1922. And the first principle it enunciated was that news organizations owed it to their readers to clearly separate news and opinion. And over the following decades, opinion writing flourished in the United States, and so did news gathering. And the idea prevailed that these roles were both important but needed to be kept distinct in order for Americans to be able to trust the media and to help them get at the truth. And then came the biggest shock to publishing and the concept of news since, I think, the invention of the printing press itself. I think for even those of us who lived through the arrival of the internet, it can be hard to realize how profound its consequences have been. And I worry a lot that I sound like the old man that I am, growling about this kind of stuff when I start to criticize it. So let me say quickly that I believe a lot of those consequences, including for journalism, have been good. As John said, I spent 15 years as a reporter at the New York Times, gone for 10 years at the Atlantic as the editor. And that was a period, the 10 years I was there, when the internet radically changed American journalism. And they were great years for the Atlantic, fun years. And we were able to publish a wider range of voices than we ever had before, many more ideas, identify promising new journalists, and make the magazine profitable for the first time in memory. It was when I came back to the Times in 2016 that I really confronted some of the less pleasant consequences for journalism, in my view, of this new technology. I was, as John said, brought in to do a version at the Times of what we'd done at the Atlantic, digitize the operation, the opinion operation, widen the range of views to better reflect the breadth and richness of American debate. People at the paper were perfectly happy with most of that. I never got an objection from inside the Times to new voices I brought in from the left. But almost every time we hired or even published a conservative, it upset at least some of the staff, starting actually from near the beginning when I hired a very proud graduate of the University of Chicago, Bret Stephens, who was already a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, and at the time one of the most eloquent critics of Donald Trump, but some of his views were just seen as beyond the pale by some of our colleagues, and they felt free to go after him on Twitter. Anyway, as John said, I lasted 4 years in that job until we published that Tom Cotton piece. And by the way, John, I never apologized for publishing that piece, just for the record. That keeps getting said. I never apologized. I did, to my discredit or shame, I was asked to apologize, and what I said was that I apologized for the pain that my leadership of the opinion department had caused. But I don't think but that episode, and it's a funny thing to work for an institution you really believed in for 19 years, and what you're known for is getting fired from it. But that's where I am. And again, you can challenge my view, and what people do, my view of what happened. But that episode was just one of the most extreme, I think, of many clashes within the Times and other newsrooms, which continue to this day between the old institutional values and the new ascendant ones. These sorts of fights didn't play out only in opinion columns. The news reporters came under heavy criticism for writing empathetically about Donald Trump or Americans who supported him. At one point in my career, as John said, I was the bureau chief in Jerusalem. It was during the Second Intifada, and I spent a lot of time in Gaza interviewing Hamas leaders and members of Hamas. It was just a basic part of my job to understand and report on their worldview, to inform Times readers of it, to better equip them to deal with it and our government to deal with it. And I never got attacked by my fellow by my colleagues for doing that kind of work. It was seen as a basic part of their job. But during this period, after the election of Donald Trump, doing that kind of journalism about our fellow citizens was seen as morally wrong, and platforming was the expression, and still is, dangerous people and ideas. And that distorted the coverage and therefore readers' understanding of life in America. And you don't need to take my word for it. And in 2020, the editor-in-chief of the Times said that the paper still didn't understand why so many people voted for Donald Trump in 2016. So how is it that a paper which prided itself for more than 100 of years doing its work without fear or favor could see it as a point of principle to declare broadly popular conservative ideas too scary to cover? A lot of the shift has to do with the illiberal ideology that percolated for years on a number of our college campuses and swept out in the last decade to really take hold on the American left, at least the affluent, educated left, from which a lot of mainstream news organizations, legacy news organizations, have for decades drawn most of their staff. As some news organizations rush to replace old print-era staff with new so-called digital natives, they fail to provide much training or insist upon their old institutional cultures. They also paid too little attention to the other cultural consequences of technological and commercial changes underway in the news industry. And those pose the deepest challenge, I think, to the old values of open-minded and fair American journalism. There are many influences at work here. Let me point to four. The first, and this is what we call in journalism, it's a story about a dog that's not barking, so it's a hard thing to capture, but the internet, as you know, wiped out a lot of local journalism. In the last 20 years, the U.S. has lost a third of its newspapers and 2/3 of its newspaper journalists. That's 43,000 jobs in all, and it's impossible to measure the civic cost of that loss. Because again, it's a dog that's not barking. It's stories that aren't being reported about local corruption. It's local officials not being held accountable for whether a pothole is getting filled. It's like opportunities for empathy, feature stories that aren't getting written about your neighbors. It is like a whole that we can't really measure in our civic life, I think, because of the wipeout of local journalism. But the other thing it did was it destroyed a critical training ground for journalists, the places where reporters came up reporting out in the real world, discovering how complicated and sophisticated people from all walks of life actually are, and also having the experience of being held accountable for your accuracy and nuance of your work. People know whether that pothole was getting filled or not, and whether you've done a good job of covering the question. Second, huge effect, social media, of course. Chris referred to it. Many of the new digital journalistic startups started freely mixing news and opinion in their reports because that's what the internet rewarded, with more shares by people who agreed with it or disagreed with it. And the old distinction between news and opinion began to break down, and to compete. Because there was a crisis of confidence in the old ways, a lot of news organizations like the Times began to adopt the same approach. Even more damaging, I think, is that, as you all know, social media is a conformity machine, and journalists began developing their own big followings on social media. And the best way to do that is to help lead one tribe or another. That not only made it even harder for journalists to do the hard work of questioning groupthink, it turned many of them into enforcers of groupthink, the very opposite of what was once understood as the ideal role. The third influence is that the internet really expanded to infinity the amount of news that could be printed every day. At the same time, we were losing all these great journalists. And we've invented whole new categories of stories and news to fill this sucking void. Think about it. How much of what you've read or watched on the internet is about stuff that's happening on the internet rather than the real world? Or maybe it's something that started in the world but then has taken on exaggerated significance in the virtual world. Memes or news, shocking tweets from famous people, or maybe even someone you've never heard of, are now news, and they generate reams of commentary and coverage. Journalists began spending more and more of their time covering these sorts of virtual events, as I think of them, or covering the world via the internet. That meant they spent less time in the real world talking to actual people. Real reporting is also expensive, much cheaper and easier to cover what's happening on the internet. And the internet also favors that kind of work because very online people will like to read about what's happening online. I'm not saying it's not worth covering, but I do think virtual events have come to occupy way too much of our attention and mislead us about the real world, to distract and confuse us even about what is real. Humans, including certainly Elon Musk, are so much more complicated and interesting and often more reasonable than the sum of their tweets or their retweets or their Instagram posts. And the internet leaves us with, and really tends to reinforce cartoonish stereotypes of people and groups we don't have personal experience with. The fourth and most profound effect is that the internet basically destroyed the century-old business model for American journalism. Advertising dollars began disappearing to the big platforms. And those news businesses that began to succeed in this new era shifted their emphasis back to relying on subscribers. And they quickly rediscovered the old lesson that the easiest way to get someone to subscribe and then to resubscribe was to constantly assure them that you saw the world the same way they did, to affirm them in their assumptions and their opinions. This is a major reason, I think, that the once mainstream media has become so partisan. One of the paradoxes of the internet is that in the year 2025, it's returned us to the business model of the 18th and 19th century and the journalistic ethos that went along with it. I think, in retrospect, it was a very happy coincidence that for about a century there, the incentives created by capitalism, at least in journalism, aligned with the fundamental values of liberalism, with liberalism's convictions about free speech, open, honest inquiry, and the value of open debate, values that the University of Chicago has been so important in promoting for so long. And for all its many failings, and we can talk about those, during the 20th century, journalism, as practiced by its mainstream publications, was a bulwark of self-government, partly because it was grounded in those values, by being humble about how little they knew, curious to learn as much as they could, and empathetic, not sympathetic. It's an important distinction to people from all walks of life. Journalists tried to provide, and often did provide, the reliable facts and the wide-ranging debate that helped other citizens form their own views about public life. The journalist's role was to be the sworn witness. The reader's role was to be the judge and the jury. And today, a lot of journalists in the institutional media believe it's the journalist's proper role, even their moral responsibility, to be the judges themselves, to instruct rather than to inform, to answer rather than to ask, to settle debates rather than to probe. In other words, to tell people what they should think rather than to help them think for themselves. That's a problem in itself. But what makes it so hard to address is that the technology and the commercial realities of the news business are also arguing now in favor of those same values. They're promoting partisanship. They're promoting contempt for other points of view. And they're promoting the value of presenting alternative versions of reality. And now I'm afraid we can add fear of the American government to that list of forces too. And that puts the serious people who are left in the institutional media in a really tough position. I empathize. They need to summon real clarity about what it is they want to stand for. They need to have the discipline to promote those values. And sometimes they have to, often now, I think, the courage to defend them and push back. This struggle also, though, requires, in the finest tradition of journalism, more serious self-scrutiny. The institutional media worries constantly over why mainstream America lost trust in it. And I think the first step to regaining that trust will be for these organizations to recognize that they broke faith with mainstream America first. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, James. And I'm going to open this up to everyone for in a few minutes, but I wanted to ask a couple of initial questions. And I'd be remiss as the moderator, given the news that broke today about the Washington Post, not to start by asking you about what happened and what your read on it is with the op-ed editor leaving there. And it strikes me, given what you just said, that the Post and the Times in particular really have a specific ideal of what an opinion page, a national opinion page, what its function is, which is not the same, for instance, as the Wall Street Journal's. And, some commentary I saw on what happened today is Bezos wants to make the Post's opinion page more like the Journal's, where you have a certain kind of ideological tilt that going in. And so I wondered, sort of in answering this question about what's specifically happening to the Post, if you could also speak a little bit about what you see as the good of an opinion page, like the one that you tried to run at the New York Times.
Well, first of all, do people know what John's referring to, this development today? There have been a series of explosions over the last couple months now at the Washington Post. It's been hard to watch what's happening there. And today, David Shipley, the editorial page editor, as John said, resigned because Jeff Bezos asked him, he wants to push the paper, the opinion pages, in a very different direction. And this is where I'm a little hesitant to judge, because we don't know fully what he is saying. But what's been reported is that he wants the paper to take clear positions in favor of capitalism and in favor of personal liberties was the other term that was used. What's weird to me is that it makes it sound like he only wants to publish those views, and will it brook no challenge to those views on the opinion page of the Washington Post. And David, who's a guy I've known a long time and a very good journalist, I've not spoken to him about this. Didn't want to be part of that plan, and that is and Marty Baron, the very, very great former editor-in-chief of the Washington Post, came out this afternoon and just blasted this decision as craven and basically as a concession to Donald Trump, and that coming from him, that's a devastating appraisal. And if Marty's right, that's a terrible sign, not only of what's happening right now, but of things to come. And that's why I started this with my own concern about what's happening to the media environment right now. It's so puzzling, John, right? Because free markets, personal liberties, I'm completely down with that. It's very weird, though, to have that, to imagine that worldview is consonant with then excluding disputation. That's like, pillars of the liberal ideal, married to the to utter intolerance. And on top of everything else, and this is part of my problem with it, and I'll come back to your question about op-ed pages, with the monoculture we're creating, it's incredibly boring. In addition to everything else, like an opinion page that only has one opinion on it is not every day, 7 days a week, or 24 hours a day. Is just like it's so anti-journalistic. And by the way, and I will say this, when I was the editorial page editor of the New York Times, I looked with envy at what the Washington Post was doing, because those guys published a much wider range of opinion than I was able to. I mean, as I said, and we got pushback for people like Bret Stephens, and they were much, and the Post has a richer tradition of this, actually. Maybe partly because it's something I've talked with friends at the Post about it. The different culture, being in Washington, not New York. They didn't have the Brooklyn problem that I had, as I came to think of it. But But they were publishing many more pro-Trump voices in the Washington Post than we were publishing in the New York Times, and basically doing a better job of that. And so it's really concerning to see them moving in what seems like exactly the wrong direction. Jeff Bezos just goes without saying, he's entitled to do whatever he wants to do with the Washington Post, and he's certainly entitled to do whatever he wants to do with the opinion pages, including not to endorse, which is the decision he made late in the campaign that upset so many people. Totally fine. I guess what I think is we need a lot more clarity as people who love the Post and readers of the Post about what it is, what the vision is here. If it's to enunciate those values more clearly as the Post editorial line, I don't have a problem with that, as long as they're forthright and transparent about that, and as long as they make room for dissent and disputation. If they don't do that, it's a terribly discouraging development that's really, I think, bad for the country and bad for the Washington Post.
I'm curious, one thing I happen to know about the Post, their journalists that maybe contributed to this culture is they're not allowed to go on Twitter and criticize, or they're much stricter about having their journalists go on Twitter and make political statements. And the only reason I bring that up is I'm curious about sort of from being on the inside at a place like the Times and seeing the culture develop there. On the one hand, the story you're telling about journalism is very much about technology and commerce, but I'm curious where you see the sort of pressure points, where the space for agency is of people who are working in these places. Is it mostly come down to a matter of leadership? Are there things that you saw work and not work at sort of creating a more open culture within the Times while you were there?
I think there was a lack of attention to kind of again, I'm trying to understand why. I mean, it was an existential crisis, and during that crisis, a lot of organizations, including the New York Times, stopped doing a lot of the training that they used to do. They stopped doing a lot of the acculturation, and there were bad parts of that too, like the brainwashing. And again, I sound like a fossil, but when I first joined the paper, every journalist who came had to do a stint on the Metro desk in New York, covering the city, being beaten up by Metro editors, and learning kind of the culture and the ways of the New York Times. Downsides to that, but big upside too, because you developed an understanding of the ethos of the place. And I think very old institutions like the New York Times, where people tended to come and stay for a long time, never really developed the habit of articulating those values to themselves, what they stand for. In fact, when I arrived as editorial page editor, I kept asking people, what does the editorial page of the New York Times stand for? Like, what are our values? The Wall Street Journal's free markets, free people. I get it. Like, that's their slogan. There was no statement. The only thing I could find was that statement by Ada Fox back in 1896. The answer was always, well, it's kind of what the family thinks, and it's what the archive says. And we actually, with the publisher, I wrote a statement of values. Sorry, long answer. There was a lack of clarity about that. So it's not the fault of the journalists who brought a different idea of what journalism is. And it wasn't just the journalists, it was new salespeople, it was coders. There was a ton of hiring that changed the nature of the workforce without a lot of conversation about this is who we are. I tell the story, when I arrived, when I was rescued and when I joined The Economist, it was still COVID times, and I was new to The Economist. I'd never worked there. So I went to the orientation for interns that was being held on Zoom, and a wonderful editor named Helen Joyce did the orientation from London. And the first thing she did was put up a PowerPoint slide that said, "This is who we are," at the top with like 4 bullet points. And I practically burst into tears. It was like, it's not hard, right? It's not that hard. And it's not an offensive conversation. Like, this is what we're always open to debate, but this is who we are. And if you don't want to be part of this project, probably should work someplace else. But they'd lost track of that. And so the Slack channels, the internal communications, and Twitter just became places where people would beat their colleagues up. And it's super hard. I'm a columnist now. though slightly protected by the journalist, the lack of bylines in the Economist. It's very hard to be an opinion writer. They're thinking out loud all the time. They're doing public thinking. And as Chris said, this is an environment where you get treated brutally for doing that kind of work often by people. You get a lot of rewards from people who agree with you. You get a lot of punishment from those who don't. That's what's making a lot of writers less interesting and more predictable. But what it means is when they take a chance, they need to have an editor that backs them up 100%. Like that, and that's what it requires in this environment. And that's what I mean about having clarity about what you stand for.
I worked briefly at a magazine where they had banned Slack for this reason. I advise it. It helped.
I've wondered about whether, just banning people. I often said when I was at the Times, and we debated this stuff at the senior levels all the time, that if they would, I would not have a problem with people tweeting if they didn't read Twitter. Like the worst part of it was paying attention to it.
So I wanted to ask you about something that you touched on today, but it's also explored in more detail in that Economist article I mentioned. You make an interesting point about the differing values between these two visions of journalism, the sort of pluralistic liberal vision that you refer to as more old-fashioned, and the newer illiberal, what you term illiberal mindset. And one of the things you say is that the old-fashioned version, while it's very skeptical on the surface, and sort of crotchety and alienated, is actually quite idealistic in the sense that it has an idealism toward the public. It believes that the public can handle that what the journalist's job is to do is to equip the public with the facts, and the public can make their own judgments. Whereas the new ethos is very idealistic on the surface because there's often a kind of very direct application of moral ideals to journalism, but it doesn't really trust the public. It's somewhat cynical about the public's ability to deal with dangerous ideas or ideas they consider dangerous. Feels the public has to be guided. And I guess I just wanted to ask you about, one thing I'll hear a lot of people say who are more from that second tendency is they'll say, well, why are you so idealistic about the public? What's your evidence that the public can actually handle the facts? And in your talk, you talked about your faith that the American mainstream still exists, that there's a mainstream audience, that deserves to be treated with the respect that you and I also think is really important. But I'm kind of curious how you respond to that kind of the people who have just become cynical about the American public.
It's funny you referred to Dewey Lippmann, that debate, and I guess I'm a little bit on the Dewey side in the end, although I increasingly think Lippmann, who, and maybe I'm being naive, my experience as a journalist, let me tell you another old story. The New York Times. When I was a political reporter back in 1996, there was a very great editor of the New York Times named Joe Lelyveld, and he used to make us do stories that we just hated. They were called Voices pieces, and you'd have to go to some place, swing, like town, state, Macomb County, Michigan in those days, York, Pennsylvania. I went there, Raleigh, North Carolina. And there was a rule, I can't remember how many it was. You had to talk to like 24 people, but you couldn't stop them in the street. You couldn't stop them at the mall. You had to knock on their doors and go to a bunch of new neighborhoods and like a vampire, persuade them to invite you inside and sit down and talk to them about who they were going to vote for and why. And it was a lot of work. It was a lot of work, and the stories weren't that interesting because there wasn't really a through line. You kind of like, there's this person and there's that person and there's this thing and there's that thing, and we'd write these stories and they wouldn't get on the front page really, and it wasn't until years later that the penny dropped for me when I was an editor myself, and I realized that Joe was teaching us. Like, he probably didn't care about those stories too much. What he cared was that we were having that experience, and the experience that I had, and not just on those stories, but when I really was a reporter, was constantly to be delighted by the intelligence and the sophistication of everybody I talked to, and And I say this and I get in arguments now more than ever about it all the time. Voters are smart. They make decisions in their own interests. They know what their interests are, and it is profoundly condescending and disrespectful to suggest otherwise. And again, maybe it sounds terribly naive, but I really, it has been my experience. We're changing, we are so disoriented and confused now about what's real, that maybe all of us are a little bit lost, and maybe that'll change. But if that's the case, then democracy's kind of over. As a journalist, our contribution to the civic project is to provide them with the truth. And this is another one of the differences between what I see as the old versus the new ideology. And many people in this room are actually educated, unlike me, and understand this stuff much better. But the old value, as cynical as my editors could seem, and they think every word out of every politician's mouth was a lie, they believed in truth. Like, they believed there was a truth out there, however difficult it might be to get at it, apprehend it, communicate it. And the new ideology really does believe that truth is a function of narrative, a word I've come to hate. And it's about power. And if that's right, then I think we're kind of lost, and maybe it's an act of faith on my part at this point.
So I'm just going to ask one more question, and then people should start to think of their own questions. Noah, I'll give you the microphone. One question just to sort of bring into the particular focus, the challenge for an opinion page in particular of covering Trump and the sort of movement around him. You've spoken yourself about how in 2016 people could have read the New York Times, opinion page and not really had any idea why so many people were voting for Trump after the election. And while you did bring in Republicans to the opinion page, I don't know, I wonder if you would say you brought anyone in who sort of represented the Trumpist part of the country. And I guess I wonder about the sort of specific challenges you see it, especially I was struck by your calling it the institutional media outlets of covering a movement that is at its core so anti-institutional. In some sense, that's sort of the animus behind a lot of the movement. And just how you would think about that as an opinion page editor, how you did the first term and how you would now. How would you find a way to represent that that part of the country or of the political scene?
Yeah, can I say quickly first, part of the problem that guys like me had trying to defend the old ways, as I keep calling it, is that we hadn't lived up to them ourselves. And it was totally fair for a lot of people to say, this is, you're a hypocrite, or where were you worrying about a wide range of views when I arrived as the editorial page editor, there were 12 columnists at the New York Times, all individually awesome. 2 of 12 were women. 1 of 12 was black. And the Times hired its first black opinion columnist in the 1990s, and it only ever had 1 at a time. 2 were conservative, or identified as conservative out of 12, and pretty much all of them supported Hillary Clinton in 2016, and not Bernie, in the primaries. So to say that here I am extolling liberalism, but people have total justice in saying this institution was not honoring that ideal for a really long time. And again, that's not a knock on any of the writers that were there, but it's a sign, I think, of the blindness and the failure, really, to again capture the wide range. Now, you're right. I didn't get a Trumpist columnist, and I looked with some envy at the Washington Post that was doing that. Again, for me, just in that, I would defend it a little bit. I tried. I didn't think at that point, and we can argue about how coherent it is, but the whole American greatness ideology, the sort of scaffolding that's been built on top of the personality of Donald Trump didn't really exist. So to be a columnist in favor of Donald Trump then was a series of really intellectually inconsistent kind of positions that were all explained, lent coherence only by support of the man. So what I'm saying, and maybe it may be defensively, is that I thought it was very hard to find a really good columnist with intellectual integrity who could take that position. Again, maybe that's, but I think it got more possible over time. But there were other voices we were missing. In the old days, there was a voice of a classic opinion voice of the American working class that populated American op-ed pages. And I'm thinking, for those who remember, of people like Jimmy Breslin. And there were important voices, particularly in New York tabloids. That voice is kind of gone. And in our era, I kept thinking it's more like it's somebody who's worked at Walmart. That was a voice I was trying very hard to find and didn't succeed in when I was there. I mean, that's the fun of doing this work. That's the point of doing this work, and that's why I was excited about it. Like, really diversifying that range is the whole point, and that's why it's so disturbing what Jeff Bezos is apparently talking about.
All right, do people give the mic to?
Thanks for your narrative explanation of the history of journalism. I found that really insightful and interesting, but I was particularly struck by how market-driven it was and how technology-driven. And so, of course, that seems to suggest that the only way in which some kind of version of broad-based media would return is if it were somehow market-driven and technology-driven. So I guess I would love to hear you address how, because you've been speaking about the principles of mainstream journalism as still laudable and making moral judgments about and political judgments about how people have negotiated this world. But given that your explanation was so market-driven and technology-driven, I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we ameliorate the problem given that diagnosis of it.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if I sounded despairing. Some days I am. I do think it's hard to overcome. I think you have to make a market. I think you, or at least you have to define it and speak to it clearly. I think, and I kept saying this also when I was at the Times, I think the readers can take it. I think the readers can take being confronted with points of view that they don't necessarily agree with. They can take being confronted with news that disappoints them. I think you, as a paper, I talked about the need to communicate internally more clearly. You have to communicate externally clearly too. You have to be telling people constantly, this is who we are. And it should flatter them, that they are among the Americans that want to participate in reality-based life. With a news organization that's seriously committed to it. And I think that there's a subscription market there. But again, this is me. This is a matter of faith. I work for a publication now that is very, very well understood by its subscriber base. And because it's been very clear. And I think it's possible, but I do think it's hard. And I think you have to be clear about it and be willing to weather a lot of pushback. I think they're trying. Look, the news organizations, the Wall Street Journal, they're one of the other big problems, though. Honestly, not to go back to the despairing side of this, is that the subscription-based news ecology shuts a lot of people out of the opportunity to get that kind of journalism. So as much as you may be able to build a basis for a successful publication, whether it can serve the kind of civic function that the news networks, for example, used to serve, that's even a harder one.
Yeah, thank you. My question is related to the last question, which is, your talk focused on sort of large scale changes of technology and economics. It seemed very persuasive. But I also want to ask you something about the personal here, which is like, when I I think about the New York Times, there's a family that goes back to Chattanooga that owns it, and they passed it on from like generation to generation. So the current publisher is a descendant of this one family, and it reminds me of like when I go to a royal portrait gallery. You see Charles the Great is the first one, and then you see his son, and then you see the grandson and and by the time you get down to Charles the Seventh, it looks the guy looks degenerate, and he doesn't look like it just doesn't look like he's up to the task. And I feel about the cases, there's something that I just wonder if that rings a bell, because because the other side is that you said again in the story that the first one, Oakes, or whatever his name is, came up with this idea: if we tell both sides of the story or really try to get it right, we've got a market. And then you told a story about that, how that gets sort of eaten away. But as you were just saying a moment ago, one of the papers I read is like The Economist. And The Economist seems to have found a market doing just that sort of thing. Along, another would be the Financial Times. So it's not like it seems to me there are, I don't know how to put it, but there seems to me like the Jeff with the Washington Post story this morning. Well, one guy owns it. With the Wall Street Journal, it turns out one guy basically owns it. And with the New York Times, there's just this family that's held on to it through passing it on in a very small, nepotistic generational thing. And I just wonder what you thought about it. I mean, that seems to me to that's part of the story.
Yeah, it is part of the story. That family takes its trust very seriously, and I think they I don't want to sound, and I think they regard that preserving those early values of the New York Times. I think they really, really care about that. I think it's hard in this day and age for the reasons I was describing, the technological and cultural ones as well. It's hard also because you use the word nepotism. And I say this with sympathy and not, or empathy, and not any judgment of it. Stepping into that role at this moment, when white male privilege is being rightly questioned, what greater privilege could there be than to ascend to the publishing role at an institution like the New York Times? That's a fraught position for anybody. That's a real burden, too, in addition to being incredible privilege. So that's hard, and I think also makes it even tougher when these political questions. So I think, it's idea, and it's a publicly traded company too, although the family controls the preferred stock. They ultimately control it. So I ultimately place the burden on them. I think in the end, they do have that weight. And I've said, I think that Times could obviously, I think they should be doing a better job of defending those values. I don't think it's because the gene pool has gotten thin. I don't think, no, these are super smart people with their heart in the right place. And I think with the requisite toughness, I hope. And I regret the way my own relationship ended with that family. And I'm not ashamed of what I did. But I wish them the best, and I wish them I wish them the courage of their convictions.
So there are some things, or there might be some things, where if you directly intentionally pursue them, it's self-undermining and you don't get them. John Stuart Mill thought that was true of happiness. Like, you shouldn't go for happiness. You just have some projects and you'll get happiness along the way. There's something like, let's say maybe modesty or unself-consciousness or something. Like, I wonder whether this could be true of like diversification and heterogeneity. That is, whether having a really diverse set of voices or diverse set of opinions, or whether getting too direct about pursuing that could be self-undermining. Like, if you think about in this room, suppose that we were going to really devote a lot of our energies to being different from one another. Suppose we were going to make that like our full-time job or something, and we're going to do it online. And we're going to try to communicate how different we are to one another through channels that the other people have to be able to receive. I think over time we'd converge. We'd become similar in that project. So like, or at least I'm not sure where that thought experiment goes, but at least it seems conceivable to me. It seems conceivable to me that certain like, and I think this happened, like online projects of sort of identity differentiation, like at least often they seem to lead to convergence. I was struck by your phrase of the conformity machine. I just wonder, like, maybe we're all conformity machines in some way. And so is there just a worry that somehow having like too direct a focus on this goal is already itself a problem?
Those are two different things, right? Like, one is, I'm not sure if I can, it's maybe too direct a focus is a problem, partly because you'll never achieve it. And you'll always be judged as falling short of, like, there's always another voice, another group that's not properly represented, something like that. I don't think our experience, unfortunately, has been that we, and I've seen newsrooms, do exactly what you describe, which has become more homogenous over time. Opinion newsrooms and news newsrooms. People begin hiring people who look like them. They hire from the same network. Despite supposed efforts to diversify, they after initial effort, they kind of fall back. In terms of whether we all wind up agreeing with each other, that's not a problem that I've noticed lately. I mean, I just don't think too much agreement is too much agreement within tribes is the problem. But on a well-curated opinion page, that's an overcomable one, I think. Do you see what I mean? Like, I think, but I may be not understanding fully that thrust. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. Before I ask my question, I just want to say I heard you on the Checks and Balance podcast of the movie podcast, and I really enjoyed your take, and I was amazed at how many movies you had seen. My question has to do with, so Jen Rubin left the Washington Post and teamed up with Norm Eisen, a politically connected liberal lawyer, to establish something called the Contrarian, which I'm sure you know about. And they're bringing in journalists, Substack writers, people offering different voices for what they think is providing some sort of accountability in this march toward what they say is autocracy. So my question is, this certainly is not a representation of what you might say was institutional media, but I'm asking, in this moment in time, do you think that's part of the solution or part of the problem?
It's part of the solution, and then I have a lot of friends that are making good livings on Substack now, and a lot of the most interesting heterodox writers in journalism, at least, have found that that's their home because they can't fit in comfortably in any publication. And if I had Jeff Bezos's money or something like that, the project I would love somebody to do is roll those people up and create a publication that would be by and large free for people with all these great, spiky, slightly disagreeable people writing really good pieces, and because it is a little bit part of the problem. Unfortunately, because it's like the problem we all have with television today. How many subscriptions do you want to have? Are you really going to curate a really capacious, diverse group of writers on Substack and read them all? It was pretty convenient when publications would do that work for you. Editors would do that work for you. And so I worry that it's a really good thing. It's great that there's so many people that are finding success on Substack. It's just further fragmenting the media environment too, though.
I was also very fascinated by your historical narrative about the 18th and 19th centuries as being sort of the age of propaganda, followed by this brief golden age of objectivity. But I was wondering if you could speak to a critique of that brief period as actually covertly also being one of propaganda. I'm sure that you're familiar with sort of like left-wing criticisms of the institutional media in the post-war period as being basically just tools of like an American national security consensus. And there was, forgive me for saying this, but there were moments in your talk when that came through in what you were saying as well, when you were talking about, our duty to the American mainstream, or the mental and political and civic well-being of the American mainstream. So I'm just wondering how you would respond to that criticism.
I mean, I think it's totally accurate criticism and totally fair. And I referred a couple points elliptically to all the failures in this. I don't regard it as a golden period in that sense. By no means were people getting it right. And I'm talking right up through the Iraq War, where there are all sorts of failures of, and that was when I referred to a moment ago. And this is not being defensive. I totally take what you're saying. What I was thinking when I referred to not living up to these liberal ideals, that was part of it. The media, it's so, as George Orwell said, to see what's in front of your face requires a constant effort, or whatever that is. We've often failed to question authority. We've often, fallen into conformist kind of pack thinking. And you can look at each of the wars, actually, and find evidence of that. Including the initial years of Vietnam, before the press acquitted itself extremely honorably, once they realized what actually was going on. But so I think, and look, Hunter S. Thompson said objective journalism is neither. Well, no, it was more clever than that. It was, objectivity is a myth. I stipulate to that, and my joke is every generation makes that discovery. This is the first generation to do something about it. I just think the struggle towards objectivity by journalists mattered. Without achieving it, none of us can. And no human being is capable of being objective. We bring our own biases in the end to the stories we choose to tell, the stories we tell. It's very imperfect. Like, journalism in the 20th century was really imperfect. I think it beats the alternative that we're living with today. And I would love to go back and do a better job, than we did then. I'm not convinced, we necessarily would. Better equipped with a more diverse journalistic workforce, drawn from more walks of life, all the sorts of things that we are getting a little bit better at. But no, I'm sorry if I sounded like I imagined it was, and I can see I did, a golden age. I don't think of it that way. I do think that the values that were prevalent then better served the reader and the Republic.
Thanks.
Hello, I'm a PhD student in communications at the University of Illinois. I think a lot about business models given the rise of AI, and I've been seeing this like trend emerging of what I call or what's been called legislation, litigation, and licensing. I'm wondering more what your views are on what lessons are there to be learned from the battles with social media or Craigslist, Google, and how they might apply in this new technology of AI, or are there more deeper structural issues about business models that might, in regardless of the technology?
Yeah, I don't really see it as, I don't draw an analogy to those previous disruptions. If that's what you're saying, it feels very different to me, and possibly renders irrelevant everything that I've bored everybody with this evening, because who knows what journalism is going to look like in a fully AI enabled reality. We're all experimenting with it, and the Economist has been very, rigorous in sort of laying out what its guidelines are for how it uses it and how it doesn't. And so far, it's wonderful in what it's enabling us to do in terms of translating our work and making it available in many more languages and things like that. Human beings still touch everything. I don't have that answer to the question, what it's going to mean. Once each of us has an AI personal assistant that we could ask to read everything for us and summarize the news. What does that mean for the business model of any individual publication is a really hard question that everybody's very worried about. And like the existential kind of panic of the journalism business is it seems to be just the way we live. Now it's always there, but yeah, we don't really know.
Just do one.
I think it's fairly clear what the role of kind of truth-based journalism might be today. I wonder if you could tell us what you think opinion writing is for today. Maybe this speaks to what Agnes was getting at, but in trying to gather together a certain kind of representative diversity of opinions, sometimes it can seem like you're just kind of getting slotted into a certain ideological point of view, and that itself can be quite boring. As opposed to, it's kind of thrilling when you see David Brooks or Ross Douthat like change their mind. And so, yeah, I guess I wonder if you could speak to how opinion writers ought to be modeling that kind of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, the kind of reductio ad absurdum of what you're talking about is the cable network news panel where people are literally, they're paid to show up and occupy a particular seat, and they can't really deviate. Their role they're supposed to play is to articulate that point of view. And I get where that idea comes from, but it creates this very kind of predictable and not very generative or fertile debate, and that is a danger for op-ed pages. And I mean, I'm using the print term for a diverse kind of media environment. I think it is valuable. And we also live in a world where you can find plenty of opinions. Like we don't lack, if you want to find opinionated voices, they're out there. I do think there's value in an individual publication curating a range of voices and then holding them to the same standards. So when the readers come, they know that people are held to the same standards for accuracy and truth, for ad hominem attack, for engaging with tough arguments on the other side rather than easy ones. It's different, like hearing an opinion in Fox, hearing an opinion on MSNBC and saying, okay, I've got the range of debate. I don't think so. And then I think, I mean, you've named two, but finding great public thinkers that are willing to change their minds and be open and honest about it. I think it's the greatest thing. I think it's the greatest thing when and there's some Matt Iglesias is a kind of a champ at this. I think if you read him often, just saying, look, I thought about this and I had it wrong. I think you earn more credibility when you do that, but we've kind of lost the habit. So I guess I totally agree with you that there's a danger in creating the kind of point by numbers approach. But the whole game and the whole fun of being an editor, honestly, is just finding writers like that, people like that, and helping, helping to the extent you can as an editor, like, helping them in that work and giving them the space and the security to do it. Be unpredictable, Do you want to say anything?
Okay. Thank you all for
Thank you
coming.
for coming.